March 17, 2026. United States Central Command confirms that multiple 5,000-pound deep penetrator munitions have just been used in combat for the very first time, striking hardened Iranian missile sites scattered along the country's coastline near the Strait of Hormuz. Pentagon officials followed up shortly after, confirming the specific weapon involved, the GBU-72 Advanced 5K Penetrator, a bomb that had never once been dropped in an actual war until that exact night. The targets weren't random either. These were sites specifically housing anti-ship cruise missiles, the exact category of weapon Iran had been using to threaten commercial shipping, transiting through one of the most economically important waterways on the planet. This wasn't a symbolic test run or a demonstration strike meant to send a message. This was the debut of a genuinely new piece of American air power, tested for years in secrecy at Eglin Air Force Base, now getting its first real combat evaluation against exactly the kind of buried, hardened target it was purpose-built to destroy. Think about the significance of a moment like that from a pure military engineering perspective. Every new weapon system in the American arsenal spends years, sometimes decades, moving through a pipeline of laboratory testing, simulated strikes, controlled range detonations, and increasingly realistic flight trials, all of it building toward a single moment nobody can fully rehearse for, the first time that weapon actually gets used against a real, defended target in an active war. Everything up to that point is a prediction, however sophisticated. The moment CENTCOM confirmed the GBU-72 had been used in genuine combat, the weapon crossed over from theoretical capability into proven battlefield reality, and everything the engineers had modeled, simulated, and tested in a controlled environment back at Eglin Air Force Base finally got measured against the messy, unpredictable reality of an actual hardened target built by an adversary specifically trying to survive exactly this kind of strike. Let's talk about why this specific weapon deserves so much more attention than a routine bombing update. Because the story of how the GBU-72 actually came to exist tells you a lot about how the Pentagon thinks about the gap between its two most extreme bunker-busting options. On one end of that spectrum sits the GBU-28, a 5,000-pound laser-guided penetrator that's been in American service since 1991, famously rushed into existence during the opening days of the Gulf War by literally repurposing retired artillery gun barrels into bomb casings because nothing else in the arsenal at the time could punch through Iraq's deepest underground command bunkers. Think about how remarkable that origin story actually is, because it tells you something important about how quickly the American defense industrial base can move when a battlefield need becomes urgent enough. Engineers in 1991 had days, not years, to solve a problem that had suddenly become critical. American forces had discovered Iraqi command bunkers buried deep enough that existing munitions simply couldn't reach them, and rather than wading through a multi-year development cycle, the solution ended up being disused artillery barrels, structurally strong enough to survive a high-speed impact into rock and concrete, hollowed out, filled with explosive, and fitted with a laser guidance kit borrowed from existing precision munitions. That improvised weapon performed well enough in combat that it stuck around in the American arsenal for over 3 decades, a genuinely impressive run for what was essentially an emergency wartime improvisation. But 3 decades is also an eternity in military technology terms, and by the time this current war against Iran was underway, the GBU-28's laser guidance system, its penetration limits, and its overall design had all started showing their age against increasingly sophisticated hardened Iranian infrastructure. On the far other end sits the GBU-57, the 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator that made headlines last June when 7 B-2 stealth bombers used it to hit Iran's Fordo and Natanz nuclear enrichment sites in Operation Midnight Hammer. The GBU-57 is an absolute monster of a weapon, capable of punching through as much as 80 meters of solid rock or 60 meters of reinforced concrete. But it comes with a massive limitation. Only the B-2 Spirit, one of the rarest and most expensive aircraft in the entire American arsenal, is certified to carry it, and even then only 2 at a time. That gap between those 2 weapons, the aging, laser-guided GBU-28 on one side and the exclusive B-2, only GBU-57 on the other, is exactly the space the GBU-72 was designed to fill. According to figures published by defense outlets tracking the program, the new weapon sits squarely in between its 2 older siblings in terms of raw penetration capability, while adding something both of those earlier options were missing: genuine flexibility in which aircraft can actually carry and deploy it. The GBU-72 pairs a 5,000-pound class warhead designated the BLU-138, with a modified guidance kit derived directly from the Joint Direct Attack munition family, the same GPS and inertial navigation system used across a huge portion of the American precision-guided bomb inventory. In practical terms, that means the weapon gets all the reliability and battlefield-proven accuracy of JDAM guidance, adapted specifically to control a Penetrator warhead roughly 3 times heavier than what that guidance system was originally designed to steer. Let's dig into the development story a bit, because it's a genuinely interesting example of how modern weapons programs try to move faster than the traditional decades-long defense procurement timeline usually allows. The program that eventually produced the GBU-72 kicked off around 2017, explicitly framed as a rapid acquisition effort rather than a slow traditional development cycle. Instead of the conventional build first, test second approach that's defined so much of American weapons development historically, engineers leaned heavily on computational modeling, running an enormous number of simulated strikes against virtual bunkers before ever committing to a physical prototype. Different soil compositions, different concrete densities, different impact angles, all of it modeled digitally first. According to reporting on the program, the eventual ground detonation test at Eglin Air Force Base ended up being the largest open-air arena test the base had ever conducted, a way of validating in the real world what all that simulation work had predicted on paper. That's a meaningfully different philosophy than the traditional trial and error process, and the relatively short timeline from program kickoff to combat deployment, well under a decade, reflects just how much that digital-first approach compressed the usual development schedule. There's something genuinely worth appreciating about that shift in methodology beyond just the speed it produced. Traditional weapons development often meant building physical prototypes, testing them against real targets, identifying failures, and iterating through another expensive, time-consuming round of construction and testing. Running thousands of simulated strikes against virtual bunkers first, varying soil composition, concrete density, and impact angle across a huge range of scenarios before ever committing to a physical build, lets engineers identify and correct design flaws at a fraction of the cost and time of physical trial and error. It's less about brute force testing and more about narrowing down, through prediction, exactly which handful of physical configurations are actually worth building and testing in the real world. That approach doesn't just save money, it fundamentally changes how quickly a weapon like this can move from a conceptual requirement to something reliable enough to trust in an actual combat scenario, which is exactly why a program that kicked off around 2017 was able to reach genuine combat deployment within roughly half the time it historically took to field comparably complex munitions. The first actual flight test happened on July 23, 2021, when an F-15E Strike Eagle released the weapon from 35,000 feet over the Eglin test range, successfully validating both a safe separation from the aircraft and the ability of that modified JDAM tail kit to actually guide a bomb nearly 3 times heavier than its original design specification. That's a genuinely impressive engineering achievement on its own, taking a guidance system built for a much lighter weapon and proving it could reliably steer something in a completely different weight class. From there, the program moved into expanding which aircraft could actually carry the weapon. On October 31, 2023, the GBU-72 completed captive carry flights on the B-1B Lancer, testing how the weapon behaved mounted externally on the aircraft's pylons without actually releasing it, an essential step before ever clearing the bomb for an actual combat drop from that specific airframe. The Air Force has also discussed eventually integrating the weapon onto the B-2A as well, though as of the weapon's combat debut, only the B-1B and the F-15E Strike Eagle had actually been cleared to carry and release it in an operational setting. Here's why that specific detail, which aircraft can actually carry this weapon, matters so much more than it might seem at first glance. The entire bunker-busting mission set in America's arsenal had been effectively bottlenecked around the B-2 for years, because the GBU-57 was simply too heavy and too specialized for any other airframe to carry. That created a genuine operational constraint. The United States only has a small number of B-2s in its entire fleet, and every single mission using the massive ordnance Penetrator required committing one of those extremely rare, extremely expensive stealth bombers to the mission, along with the enormous supporting package of tankers, fighter escorts, and electronic warfare aircraft needed to get a B-2 safely in and out of contested airspace. That's an enormous amount of operational overhead for a single strike package. Multiply that overhead across every hardened target identified over the course of a months-long air campaign, and the limitation becomes obvious fairly quickly. A war that generates dozens or even hundreds of individual hardened targets simply cannot be fought exclusively through a fleet of aircraft numbering in the low double digits, no matter how capable each individual sortie turns out to be. At some point, the sheer volume of targets outpaces the sustainable operational tempo of the rarest platform in the entire arsenal, and commanders are forced to either accept leaving some hardened targets unaddressed or find a way to broaden which aircraft can actually carry a weapon capable of doing the job. The GBU-72 breaks that bottleneck completely, Suddenly, a B-1B Lancer, an aircraft the United States has considerably more of, and one that doesn't require anywhere near the same level of specialized mission planning and stealth coordination as a B-2 sortie, can carry a genuine bunker-busting weapon capable of reaching deeply buried hardened targets that previously would have required either a much less effective legacy weapon or the full weight of a dedicated B-2 mission. Let's talk about what the B-1B itself actually brings to this equation, because it's a genuinely different kind of aircraft than the B-2, built around an entirely different philosophy. The B-1 is a supersonic, long-range bomber capable of carrying one of the largest conventional payloads in the entire American arsenal, up to 84 precision-guided glide bombs or as many as 36 long-range cruise missiles in a single mission, more ordnance than many dedicated guided missile warships carry. It can stay over a combat zone for more than 6 hours at a time, providing sustained close air support rather than a single quick strike and immediate withdrawal. It's also equipped with advanced targeting systems specifically designed to help distinguish legitimate military targets from friendly or civilian presence on the ground, a capability that matters enormously when you're flying repeated missions over the same contested territory rather than a single, tightly choreographed stealth run. Put a genuine bunker-busting weapon like the GBU-72 into that airframe's arsenal, and you fundamentally change the math around how often and how flexibly the United States can go after deeply buried, hardened targets across an active war zone. There's also a simple numbers argument worth spelling out here, because it's easy to understate just how significant the difference in fleet size actually is between these two bomber types. The B-2 fleet has always been tiny by design, a deliberately small number of extraordinarily expensive stealth aircraft, each one costing well over $1 billion and requiring specialized maintenance facilities and highly restricted basing arrangements to preserve its stealth coding and sensitive systems. The B-1B fleet, while it's also shrunk over the decades from its Cold War era peak, still represents a considerably larger pool of available aircraft, ones that don't require anywhere near the same specialized handling, don't rely on radar-evading stealth coatings that need constant maintenance, and can be surged into a forward operating location like RAF Fairford in a matter of days, rather than requiring the kind of extraordinarily careful mission planning a B-2 sortie into contested airspace typically demands. Multiply that fleet size difference by the frequency of missions, you can now fly with genuine bunker-busting capability, and you start to see just how much this single new weapon changes the sustainable pace of an extended bombing campaign. Now let's talk about the broader buildup that made this specific strike possible in the first place, because the GBU-72's combat debut didn't happen in isolation. It happened right in the middle of a genuinely significant expansion of American bomber presence in the region. In the days leading up to that March strike, the United States dramatically ramped up its bomber footprint at RAF Fairford in the United Kingdom after British officials changed course and agreed to allow American warplanes to actually conduct strikes on Iran directly from installations based on UK soil. By the start of that week, there were 9 American bombers stationed at Fairford, 3 B-52 Stratofortresses, and 6 B-1B Lancers. Within just a few days, that number had grown to 15 total bombers, 3 B-52s, and a full 12 B-1Bs. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had told reporters around that same period that airstrikes on Iran were about to surge dramatically, and the buildup at Fairford was the physical manifestation of exactly that promise. Analysts covering the deployment noted that bomber aircraft achieve far greater and more varied effects when they're actually able to strike targets directly, dropping bellies full of precision-guided munitions, rather than relying purely on standoff cruise missiles fired from a safe distance. That distinction matters enormously for bunker-busting missions, specifically, since achieving the kind of precise penetration a weapon like the GBU-72 requires generally benefits from a direct release, rather than routing everything through a standoff missile's own separate flight profile. It's worth remembering just how significant a shift it was for the United Kingdom to actually agree to let American strikes launch directly from its own soil, because that's not a decision any Allied government makes lightly. Hosting the physical launch point for combat strikes against another sovereign nation carries real political and legal weight, opening the host country up to exactly the kind of retaliatory targeting concerns Iran had already been signaling toward other American basing locations across the region. The fact that British officials changed course and agreed to allow this kind of forward basing tells you just how seriously America's closest ally had come to view the broader stakes of the conflict. And it directly enabled the kind of rapid, large-scale bomber buildup that made a weapon debut like the GBU-72's first combat use logistically possible in the first place. Without that shift in British policy, the same strike package would have had to launch from considerably farther away, adding hours of flight time and additional aerial refueling requirements to every single mission. There's a deeper strategic question worth sitting with here, and it's the one that honestly should be at the center of this entire story. Why did the United States need a whole new class of bunker-busting weapon at this stage of the war at all, months after Operation Midnight Hammer had already delivered what the administration publicly described as the total elimination of Iran's nuclear infrastructure? That's the honesty check worth applying directly. According to satellite imagery collected by civilian spatial intelligence firms in the months following those original strikes, Iran had been observed adding fresh layers of concrete, soil, and sand directly over the tops of previously damaged facilities. Precisely the kind of hardening effort you'd expect from a country trying to reconstitute or at least protect infrastructure that hadn't actually been as thoroughly destroyed as the initial victory announcement suggested. That single detail tells you almost everything about why a weapon like the GBU-72 became necessary in the first place. If the original strikes had genuinely eliminated every piece of hardened infrastructure the way officials claimed in the immediate aftermath, there wouldn't be a continuing need to keep developing and fielding new bunker-busting capability against fresh targets month after month. The fact that Iran kept reinforcing facility after facility, and the fact that the American military kept needing new tools specifically designed to defeat exactly that kind of reinforcement, tells its own story about how incomplete the earlier round of destruction actually turned out to be. Let's get into the specific targets hit during that first combat use, because the choice of what to strike with this brand new weapon wasn't arbitrary. CENTCOM specifically identified the targets as hardened missile sites along Iran's coastline near the Strait of Hormuz, housing anti-ship cruise missiles that had been actively threatening commercial shipping transiting through the strait. Remember, this entire stretch of the war has revolved around control of that single narrow waterway, roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply moving through it on a normal day. And Iran's primary tool for menacing that shipping lane has been exactly this kind of coastal missile infrastructure, cruise missile batteries tucked into hardened positions along the shoreline, difficult to hit with conventional munitions, precisely because they'd been built to survive exactly the kind of airstrikes Iran knew were coming. Choosing to debut the GBU-72 against this specific target set wasn't a coincidence. It was a direct statement about exactly what problem this weapon was built to solve. Hardened coastal missile infrastructure that had been surviving lighter conventional strikes precisely because it had been engineered from the start to withstand them. Picture what a target like that actually looks like from an engineering standpoint, because it explains why lighter conventional munitions kept falling short against it. A coastal missile bunker built specifically to protect anti-ship cruise missiles from exactly the kind of airstrikes Iran knew were coming isn't just a shed with a roof over it. It's typically built into natural rock formations or reinforced with multiple layers of concrete, specifically angled and reinforced to deflect or absorb the blast force of a conventional bomb. Standard precision guided munitions, even ones carrying a reasonably sized warhead, are generally designed to detonate on or near the surface of a target, which works fine against exposed vehicles, radar installations, or lightly protected structures, but does almost nothing against a facility specifically engineered to survive that exact kind of surface level blast. You need a weapon that can actually punch through that outer layer of protection before detonating, which is the entire specialized function a penetrator warhead like the BLU-138 inside the GBU-72 is built to perform, using its own kinetic mass and structural toughness to physically drive through layers of rock and reinforced concrete before its fuse triggers the actual explosive charge at the depth where it will do genuine damage. Let's think about the lethality claims being made around this weapon too, because that's a piece of the story worth examining honestly, rather than simply repeating uncritically. According to the GBU-72's own program manager, the weapon's lethality was expected to be significantly higher than older penetrating munitions in the American arsenal, a claim built on the extensive computational modeling and simulation work that went into designing the BLU-138 warhead in the first place. A claim like that is worth taking seriously precisely because of how it was generated, not through guesswork or marketing language, but through the same extensive computational modeling process that shaped every other aspect of this weapon's design from the very beginning. That's a credible claim coming from someone with direct insight into the engineering behind the weapon. But it's also worth remembering that a single combat debut, however successful the initial reporting suggests it was, isn't the same as a fully proven battle-tested track record across dozens of strikes against varied target types. Every new weapon system carries some gap between its laboratory and simulation performance and its actual behavior across a wide range of real-world combat conditions, different soil compositions, different structural designs, different weather and approach angles. The GBU-72's first combat use against coastal missile bunkers gives us a genuine data point, but it's still a single data point, and the broader track record of this weapon across the following months of the war will matter far more than how impressive its debut looked in the initial reporting. That single data point, promising as it looks, is still just the opening chapter of a much longer track record this weapon will need to build over the following months. Here's an interesting wrinkle worth mentioning. because it complicates the neat, simple story of exactly which weapon actually flew on that first mission. Some of the earliest reporting on this exact class of strike specifically hedged on the details, with CENTCOM confirming the use of 5,000-pound class penetrator munitions without immediately specifying the precise weapon system involved, and some outlets noting that unconfirmed earlier reports had suggested the GBU-72 might have already seen limited use during operations in Yemen back in 2024, well before this officially reported combat debut against Iran. That kind of ambiguity is fairly normal in the fog of an active, fast-moving conflict, where official confirmations often lag behind the actual battlefield reality by days or weeks, and where the exact weapon system involved in any single strike doesn't always get immediately or precisely disclosed to the public. Regardless of exactly which specific mission earns the technical distinction of being the very first combat use, the broader picture remains the same. A next-generation 5,000-pound bunker-busting weapon has now entered the active rotation of American airpower being used against Iran, carried by aircraft considerably more numerous and less operationally constrained than the exclusive B-2 fleet that had previously monopolized this entire category of deep penetrating strike. Let's zoom out and think about what this specific weapon's introduction tells us about the broader trajectory of American bunker-busting technology, because the GBU-72 isn't the end of this particular story, it's really just the middle chapter. The Air Force has already awarded a contract for the design of what's being called the Next Generation Penetrator, explicitly intended to eventually replace the 30,000-pound GBU-57 itself, the same weapon that made headlines during Operation Midnight Hammer. Details on that future weapon remain limited, but the Air Force has specifically asked industry partners to design it so that it doesn't exceed 22,000 pounds, considerably lighter than the current massive ordnance penetrator, while still delivering comparable or improved blast and fragmentation effects against hard, deeply buried targets. Boeing, the same manufacturer behind both the original GBU-57 and the newer GBU-72, has already been brought on to design that future weapon's tail kit. That's a genuinely notable detail on its own, having the same company responsible for both ends of the current bunker-busting spectrum also lead development of whatever eventually replaces the heaviest weapon in that lineup. It suggests the Air Force is treating this entire category of deep penetration weaponry as a single continuous design lineage rather than a series of disconnected, one-off programs, carrying forward lessons learned from the GBU-72's rapid, simulation-heavy development approach directly into whatever comes next. Given how much faster that computational modeling first methodology got the GBU-72 from initial contract to combat deployment compared to older, more traditional development timelines, there's every reason to expect the Next Generation Penetrator program will lean even more heavily on exactly that same approach, potentially compressing its own path to combat readiness even further than the roughly decade-long journey the GBU-72 took from its 2017 origins to its March 2026 debut over Iran. Think about the pattern in full. The United States isn't just building one new bunker-busting weapon to fill a gap in its arsenal, it's systematically working to make its entire deep penetration strike capability lighter, more flexible, and less dependent on a tiny handful of specialized, expensive stealth aircraft. The GBU-72 filling the gap between the GBU-28 and GBU-57 is really just the first visible step in that broader effort. There's a real strategic logic behind why this matters so much beyond the immediate context of the Iran War too. Every time a bunker-busting mission requires a B-2, you're committing one of the rarest, most expensive, and most operationally sensitive aircraft the United States possesses, along with the enormous tanker, escort, and electronic warfare package needed to get it safely to target and back. That's an approach that works when you genuinely need to hit the single, hardest, most deeply buried target in an adversary's entire arsenal, exactly the scenario Fordo represented. But it's an incredibly expensive and operationally constrained way to handle the much broader category of merely hardened, rather than maximally hardened targets that show up throughout any extended air campaign: coastal missile bunkers, buried command centers, reinforced storage facilities. Having a weapon like the GBU-72 that a considerably larger fleet of B-1s, and eventually potentially other aircraft as well, can carry and deploy means the United States doesn't have to reserve its absolute rarest and most sensitive stealth assets for every single target that happens to be buried under a meaningful amount of concrete or rock. That's a genuine force multiplier, freeing up the B-2 fleet specifically for the hardest, most consequential targets, while routing the much larger volume of merely hardened targets toward a considerably more available and more flexible platform. Let's also talk honestly about what this entire episode reveals about the state of Iran's underground defensive infrastructure at this stage of the war, because the fact that the United States needed to introduce an entirely new weapon class specifically to deal with coastal missile bunkers tells you Iran had clearly learned real lessons from the earlier phases of this conflict. After watching facility after facility get targeted throughout the opening months of the war, Iranian military planners had every incentive to harden their remaining infrastructure as aggressively as possible, burying missile storage deeper, reinforcing overhead protection, learning from exactly which target types had proven vulnerable to earlier American strikes and adjusting accordingly. The GBU-72's combat debut against exactly this kind of hardened coastal target is, in a sense, a direct response to that adaptation, an acknowledgement that Iran's defensive engineering had genuinely improved enough across the preceding weeks of fighting that older, lighter penetrating munitions were no longer reliably getting the job done against the specific category of missile infrastructure most directly threatening shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. So where does all of this leave the broader trajectory of the air campaign against Iran? With 15 bombers now stationed at RAF Fairford, a mix of B-52s and B-1Bs, and with the GBU-72 now cleared and combat proven for exactly the kind of hardened coastal missile targets that had been menacing shipping through the strait, the operational tempo of bunker busting strikes against Iran was positioned to increase significantly beyond what the exclusive B-2 fleet alone could ever have sustained. That's not a small shift in capability. It's a fundamental change in how frequently and how flexibly the United States could go after exactly the category of target that had proven most consistently troublesome throughout this entire conflict: hardened, buried infrastructure, specifically engineered to survive conventional airstrikes. And with the next-generation Penetrator already in early development, specifically intended to eventually replace even the massive GBU-57 itself, the broader arc of American bunker-busting technology points toward a future where deep penetration strikes stop being the rare, exclusive domain of a handful of B-2 sorties and become an increasingly routine, increasingly available tool spread across a much wider portion of the entire bomber and fighter fleet. I want to know what you think about how significant this specific weapons introduction actually turns out to be in the broader arc of this war. Do you think spreading genuine bunker-busting capability across a much larger fleet of B-1s and F-15Es fundamentally changes how sustainable this kind of air campaign can be over the following months? Or do you think the underlying challenge, Iran's continued ability to harden and rebuild its infrastructure faster than any single new weapon can permanently solve, remains the real story here regardless of which specific bomb gets used? Drop your thoughts down in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of technical development that tends to get buried under bigger, more dramatic headlines, even though it genuinely reshapes how an entire air campaign can be sustained over the long run. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly why this particular weapon matters and how it fits into the broader story of America's bunker-busting arsenal, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps. Put detailed analysis like this in front of more people trying to follow the technical side of this conflict rather than just the headline strikes. And if you want to keep following how this new capability actually gets used across the rest of the war, go ahead and subscribe, because this is clearly not the last new weapon we're going to see introduced before this conflict finally winds down. Thanks so much for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one.